Hello and welcome. Today I would like to talk about voodoo magic and if it is possible to raise something from the dead. Some time ago I got a box full of electronic scrap and some parts which had huge impact on the history of 3D graphics and computer games in particular. I guess I don't need to explain why I was so glad to find multiple 3D FX voodoo graphics accelerators there. So let's take a look. First of all, there was this plain no-name 3DFX Voodoo card. The 3DFX company didn't have own factories in the beginning, so they sold their ICs and licensed other companies to produce the 3D graphics accelerators. The product itself was such a huge success that countless companies all over the world jumped onto the train and flooded the market. This no-name card is probably one of the countless examples. However, most of the 3DFX Voodoo cards were more or less similar. Even the PCB layout was pretty much the same, as well as the performance. One of the more popular manufacturers of the 3DFX Voodoo cards was Diamond, and they produced the famous Diamond Monster 3D, which was the second card which I found in the scrap. As you can see, the cards do look very similar, despite that they were produced by different companies. Anyway, 3DFX Voodoo got very hot, and it was a common practice to put some heat sinks on the ICs. As you can see on the glue residues, probably a heat sink was glued at least on one of the ICs and obviously removed later. The third and the last card, which was in the scrap, is another Diamond Monster 3D. This one is from slightly different revision, but looks again very similar. As you probably already noticed, the first two cards do not have a slot bracket, but this third one has. Well, the thing is, I already took a look on these cards and made some pre-analysis. All three cards didn't have the slot brackets and were not working at all as I got them, but as I already mentioned, these cards could get very hot, and due to permanent heating up and cooling down, the 3DFX Voodoo cards were notorious to fail due to broken contacts around the main ICs. Since this issue is so common, I already tried to reflow the solder off camera just as I showed it in my last video. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please feel free to take a look. Well, reflowing the solder resurrected this card and now it is fully working. I already added a 3D printed bracket and this card is ready to use. However, the other two are still failing. This Diamond Monster 3D is unfortunately completely dead. As I was soldering, I realized that some of the legs of the IC were twisted and accordant pads were damaged. Probably someone removed the heatsink with a lot of force and unfortunately damaged the card physically. This no-name card was also completely dead at first try, but after reflowing the solder, it was halfway back to life. It works, but it shows a lot of visual defects, and in this video I would like to take a closer look at it. First, let's take a look at the test hardware. My standard test PC for PCI cards is a Pentium 3 500 MHz system based on Intel BX Slot 1 mainboard like this one. However, I run into huge problems trying to test Voodoo 1 cards in this system. The CPU seems to be just too fast. The Voodoo card runs very unstable and with a lot of weird graphical glitches. So I switched to the Super Socket 7 mainboard with K62 at 450 MHz, and this time the 3DFX Voodoo ran rock solid. Since the 3DFX Voodoo 1 is an add-on card, it needs an additional 2D graphics card. For the test, this AGP ATI Rage did the job very well. So let me show how the image of this working Diamond Monster 3D looks like. On this machine I have only DOS and a Tomb Raider demo which works with 3DFX. This is not too much but sufficient for today's topic. I'm sorry for interferences of the screen with my camera, but I hope that you can see that the rendered image is clean. All textures are rendered properly and also no damaged surfaces are visible in the game menu. Now let's try the other no-name 3DFX Voodoo card and see what we get. You can see the problems already in the shadow of the 3DFX logo, which has holes in it. Also in the main menu, you can see a lot of damaged rectangles and flickering. Also the text letters are mostly affected. In the game itself, all textures are broken. There are a lot of white and black spots all over the place. Take a look at the plant's textures. They seem also to have broken pixels, where transparent pixels are to be expected. One important observation is that there seem to be no broken static areas on the screen. Can you see it? When I rotate the camera, the glitches move together with related polygons. This means that only textures seem to be affected. What could this mean for our test subject? Well, take a look at the 3DFX card once again. Let's go through the ICs and see what they are responsible for. The largest IC is named FBI or Frame Buffer Interface. As the name implies, this IC is responsible for the frame buffer. Usually, all the pixels are drawn into one frame and then the frame is presented to the user. So the frame is actually the image which you see. Well, we probably don't have any issues with this IC on this card, since if it would be faulty, we would see broken static areas on the screen, which are independent from the camera movement. The second IC is named TMU, or Texture Mapping Unit, and this one is responsible for the texture projection onto the polygons. So this could be interesting for us, because our broken textures could be a result of faulty TMU. As in most of the 3DFX Voodoo cards, this one has 4 megabytes of memory divided into 8 ICs with 512 kilobyte each. 2 megabyte of this memory are dedicated to the frame buffer, and another 2 megabyte are used by the texture mapping unit. Since we seem to have only texture issues, we should probably concentrate first on the TMU and the coordinate memory block. And since it should be easier to exchange the memory, let's start with it. Unfortunately, I have no spare memory which would fit into this Voodoo card, but I have a donor. The other Diamond Monster 3D with the damaged frame buffer interface can give us a bunch of memory ICs. I don't know if they work, but well, what do we lose? So let's try. I guess I'll try to replace only the texture memory and leave the frame buffer memory in place for now, just to see if it makes any difference. However, I'll desolder all the memory ICs from the donor board. I think it doesn't need them anymore anyway. I will use some Kapton tape to prevent other parts from needless overheating. Okay, the texture memory ICs are off the PCB, and I have a funny idea. Let's start Tomb Raider without these chips and see if it works and how does it look like. Well, it seems to work indeed, but as you can see, all the textures are gone and we can only see untextured polygons. Obviously, Lara seems to be not textured and contains only colored polygons. Okay, the good thing is that at least what we can see has no obvious visual errors. Also in the menu, I can't see any flickering anymore, which is a sign that the theory about affected textures related part of the card could be true. Now let's solder the memory ICs, which we got donated from the Diamond Monster card. I honestly have to admit that I'm not very experienced with this type of SMD soldering. I did it only once before, but I guess the more practice, the better. The magic formula for SMD soldering is, as always, a lot of flux. When soldering SMD, especially with a little space between the contacts, always clean the board with alcohol after soldering. The flux can be conductive and will shorten the contacts, resulting in various unexpected, strange, and complicated to analyze behavior. Time to test. Well, this looks a little bit different, but still quite broken. In the main menu, we have less flickering. The in-game textures are still broken. However, in the outside area, the textures look a lot better, but the plants still have a lot of broken pixels in the transparent area. Well, just in case, off camera, I replaced the other 4 memory modules, which belong to the frame buffer, but just as expected, it didn't bring any improvement. Well, maybe the memory from the donor board was defective as well. Unfortunately, I can't validate it now. However, I'm still quite sure that the issue is related to the texture unit, and I guess we can go another step forward and try to transplant the TMU IC from our donor card. It could be broken as well, so it is kind of flying blind, but what do we lose again, yeah? When desoldering such ICs, I always try to keep them from overheating. With a layer of masking tape as isolator and a Kapton tape, the temperature on the die can be drastically reduced. I desoldered the TMU from our no-name Voodoo card in the same way. I did it off camera to not have it in my way because it is very easy to lift the pads and I needed to be more concentrated. And again, I covered everything around with Kapton tape to avoid the damage of the other parts. Soldering such a TMU IC is a little bit more complicated, but very similar to the reflow technique which I showed in my last video. First of all, the pads must be really clean. I'm using solder wick to remove all the old solder from the pads. You have to be very careful here to not to overheat and lift the pads. Now when the pads are free from the old solder, I clean them with some IPA. Just as always with SMD parts, use a lot of fresh flux on the contacts or your soldering will end up in a disaster. When putting the IC onto the PCB, be sure about the orientation of the IC or say goodbye to your hardware. I am very sorry for the bad camera, but aligning the IC can be very tedious work. You have to take your time, enough light, and maybe magnifying glass to be really sure. It is quite complicated to align the IC from all 4 edges simultaneously and keep it in place. So the best is to align it as good as you can and then solder some legs of the IC on one side and then realign it if needed and solder again some legs on the opposite side. When done, before soldering all the other legs, take a magnifying glass and go over all edges once again and make sure that all the legs are aligned on the related pads as good as possible. When everything is checked twice, just put some solder on the tip of your iron and go over the pins of the IC in the same way as I showed in my last video. And don't forget to clean everything with alcohol after you are done. Time to test again. Okay, at least our voodoo card seems to be still working. This is already quite a relief. The image looks a lot better, however, I still can see some glitches. In the main menu of the game, there are still some decent black vertical lines. The game itself looks much better. However, on the floor I can see some regular yellow spots, but the plant textures look now as expected. This result is very promising. I will take a looking glass again and see if any pins of the IC are shorted or were not soldered properly. Okay, after some careful looking through all the soldering work, I found two contacts of one texture memory IC to be shortened. Let's fix it and see if this solves our last issues. Again, just adding some flux and short touch of the hot iron tip should reflow the solder towards the pins and remove the breach. Here you go. Back to the test bench. And finally, the 3DFX logo doesn't have any holes anymore. The image looks as clean as a skin of a baby. We don't get any black stripes in the menu, and the game itself looks clean as well. All the textures are clean, and the transparent pixels on the plants look also as they should. Great! I'm glad to say that this repair was a full success. We replaced the memory chips and the texture mapping unit. I assume that the memory was not the culprit. I guess it was the TMU from the beginning, but unfortunately I can't tell definitely what exactly was bad about it. If you know a way how to test the memory on a 3DFX without desoldering it, I would be glad to know about it in the comments. The memory ICs which I took from the donor board are a little bit slower. They are 45 nanoseconds against the 35 nanoseconds as before, but well, as far as I know, everything below 50 nanoseconds is sufficient for a 3DFX Voodoo 1, so it shouldn't be an issue. Maybe I will put some heatsinks on the ICs to prevent them from overheating in the future, but for now there is only one last thing I can do for this card, the slot bracket. I don't have a metal bracket, but I designed and printed one on my 3D printer. And here it is, one glorious item of the computer history risen from the dead and waiting to be used in a retro gaming machine. And if you still don't believe in voodoo magic, there is nothing I can do for you. Well, at this point, I would like to thank my brother for the cool intro for my channel. I hope you liked it and enjoyed the video as well. Just as always, please leave your comments, likes and dislikes below. If you like my channel, please consider to subscribe, to share and support it in any way you wish. So far, thank you and goodbye.